The outdoor community knows the importance of margins.
Oh, she almost just got swept.
The seemingly small efforts made at just the right moments carry enough weight to tip the scale from failure to success.
Jessica Diggins going for her first win of the season, and it's Jessie Diggins of the United States.
The margins, those places where we are made or defeated, keep us coming back for more.
More than 15,000 scientists are sounding an alarm about climate change. They call it a warning to humanity.
Environmental and political history are also made at the margins.
That is why it matters. 29 electoral college votes.
77,000 votes in key districts swung the 2016 presidential election. 3 Senate votes opened the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge to drilling. To solve the climate crisis, the world needs our community. It's the sum of our small efforts where we turn our passion into purpose and deliver climate victories where they're needed most.
My name is Nathan Osborne from the Protect Our Winters Colorado Local Alliance. We're super excited for this event's finally happening, and welcome to the Keep Paris conversation with Paul Bodnar and Maddie Phanuef, sponsored by the Local Alliance. We are extremely excited this event is finally happening and encouraged by everyone's attendance. But before we begin, I'd like to say something on behalf of the Local Alliance. It wasn't easy to come up with, but we felt like it was something we needed to say. Last week, Protect Our Winters released a statement in direct response to the police brutality and the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and countless others, who all deserve recognition and space. At this time, I'd like for all of us to take that space and honor their lives with 30 seconds of silence. Thank you. As a reminder from that statement, we stand in solidarity with Indigenous peoples, low-income families, people of color, and other historically marginalized communities in the fight for justice against systematic racism. We know that there are more conversations that must take place to explicitly address the intersections of race and climate far beyond the conversation we're having today. We acknowledge that this takes individual and collective work, and that they may be uncomfortable conversations at times. The Local Alliance seeks to prioritize and more deeply understand this intersection. Sorry, I just have a couple notes so I don't forget anything. As the planet warms and the ramifications of climate change become worse, Black, Indigenous, people of color suffer the most, and we need systematic changes to address both. With that being said, I think today's topic is appropriate. I'd like to introduce our guests, Paul Bodnar and Maddie Phanuef. Paul served in the Obama White House as a special assistant to the president and senior director for energy and climate to the president, and senior director for climate change at the National Security Council. He played a principal role in formulating U.S. strategy during the Paris Climate Conference. Maddie has been on the U.S. biathlon team for 5 years, representing Team USA at the 2018 Winter Olympics. She believes in advocating for environmental sustainability, which is why she joined Protect Our Winters Athlete Alliance in 2016. Thank you both for joining us. We're looking forward to today's discussion. The format is going to be about 25 to 30 minutes of presentation from Paul, and then we're going to bring Maddie on to expand the discussion. Feel free to enter your questions in the chat, and towards the end, hopefully, we'll be able to get into some of the group questions. Paul?
Hey guys, thanks Nathan. Thanks so much for the introduction. It's awesome to be here. Can you hear me all right? Cool. I'm thrilled to join you and honored to do this jointly. So as Nathan said, I was lucky enough to be on the team that designed and negotiated the Paris Agreement on climate change. The Paris Agreement was the result of 30 years of trial and error, and it was the hardest thing ever attempted in the history of global diplomacy. Now, I know it can be hard to wrap your head around something like Paris if you're not an expert in treaties, which most people aren't. But if you're confident in talking about it, that will help you raise your game as an advocate and persuade others to get engaged in protecting the places that we love on the one planet that we have. So today I'm going to tell you why climate change is the wickedest problem in international relations, how we solved it with Paris, and why it's worth fighting for. So first of all, it's not easy to deal with climate change on a global level. You know, greenhouse gas emissions are related to everything we do. They're entangled in every part of our day-to-day lives. Every time we turn on a light bulb, every time we drive a car, every time we eat a burger. So it's hard to figure out what to do about it because it's everywhere. And then on the international side, the world is divided into 200 little pieces. Now, climate change doesn't care about borders, but politicians sure do. And each country in the world only owns a small piece of the problem and is motivated to look after its own self-interest. The United Nations is a body of sovereign states. There's no formal hierarchy among them. They all have an equal voice, from giant China to tiny Liechtenstein. There's no world government, obviously. So there's no way of making formal decisions about what to do about global problems like climate change, except by consensus, which means that all the countries need to agree on every little detail on what to do. Not just that, every word of every decision that the UN will draft, like the Paris Agreement. Any country can veto anything. The slogan is, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. So if you think that the UN had figured out how to solve global problems like climate change by the time climate change came along as an issue of public concern, you'd be wrong. My poli-sci professor used to say, nothing focuses the mind like the prospect of imminent violent death. And that's what the UN was good at dealing with. The prospect of imminent violent death, arms control, nuclear weapons treaties. That's what we had done in the few decades that we'd even been trying to solve problems on a global level when climate change came along in the 1980s. And climate change was a really difficult problem because the costs and benefits of dealing with it are separated across space and time. In other words, if you wage a campaign to shut down a coal plant here in Colorado and replace it with solar, from a climate perspective, you won't see the benefits of that yourself. Those benefits will accrue mainly to the grandchildren of other people in some other part of the world. So that's kind of the scene. You have to imagine kind of what the world is dealing with. Now, still in the early years of climate action, starting around the mid-1980s, things were promising at first. We had just figured out how to fix the ozone layer, right? We were feeling pretty good about ourselves as international environmental problem solvers, including in the diplomatic arena. And so when climate came along, first people thought of it as just another environmental problem. Countries started working on it. They weren't paying too much attention to it at first. It wasn't too controversial. And the problem seemed pretty simple. Okay, let's work out how much pollution is the maximum we want. Let's figure out who's polluting, divide it up, and assign targets to different countries that are proportional to what they emitted in the past, and make it legally binding. Very simple in approach. And that's what happened with the first international treaty that was negotiated on climate change, called the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. Excellent acronym. But it felt low stakes at the time. And if you want proof of how low stakes it felt internationally, George Bush Sr. personally traveled to Rio to sign that agreement, and Mitch McConnell spoke in favor of it on the floor of the Senate. Later came the Kyoto Protocol, similar deal, similar principle, but fundamentally an environmental policy solution to an environmental problem. But it didn't work out so well for three reasons. First, people realized of course, it was an environmental problem, but for humanity, it was more of an economic and development issue, again, entangled in every aspect of life. It felt hard and complicated to deal with it. And at the time, it was generally understood that cheap fossil fuels had made it possible for rich countries to develop quickly. So that raised the stakes for everybody because it was about who had the right to develop, how much it was going to cost, why did these rich countries get to benefit from cheap fossil fuels? And now we were telling a different set of countries that they couldn't do it anymore. And climate was seen as an economic trade-off because clean energy was way more expensive than solar, or wind in the 1990s and even in the 2000s. The second reason that it didn't work out because climate change started getting real. It went from being a kind of hazy thing in the future and very uncertain to very much certain and very much on our doorstep and in our day-to-day lives. And the third reason is that geopolitics got in the way. China and other emerging markets went from being a tiny slice of the emissions problem to a huge one virtually overnight. China surpassed the US as the largest emitter of greenhouse gases in around 2007 and quickly rose to double and beyond the level of the US. And it became a big economic competitor of the United States. So it wasn't okay anymore for the US to give a pass to China on this environmental problem. It became core to our economic competition and our vision of what we were going to do in the future. And of course, it wasn't okay from a scientific point of view either to give emerging economies a pass because they had become the majority emitters of greenhouse gases. So the Kyoto Protocol, which some of you may have heard of or remember, and probably most of you don't, languished for a few years. It was actually negotiated by Bill Clinton. Bush pulled out in 2001. Remember that for later. Paris is not the first global climate agreement we've pulled out of. So when President Obama came in, and the team started looking at what we could do here, we realized that we had to build this around an international solution around the perceived self-interest of countries. We needed to entice China and other emerging economies in. We needed to show to American interests that those countries were part of the solution and not being treated as some completely different category. And of course, from those countries' perspectives, this was still a time when clean energy was reaching cost parity with fossil, not quite there yet. And so they felt pretty comfortable in that old framework where they didn't have to do much. We also realized that this idea of negotiating targets at the UN, where the UN would assign targets to different countries in effect, or at least that's how it was perceived, was definitely anathema to the US and a lot of other folks. So we needed to try to create a bottom-up system that would let countries set their own targets, but still have those targets be strong enough on aggregate to address the problem as fast as it needed to be addressed. And so in 2009, actually just 9 months after President Obama came into office, we had the first go, which was the Copenhagen Climate Conference. Okay, so you got to imagine the largest ever gathering of world leaders in Copenhagen at the end of a 2-week negotiation where you had 30,000 people running around a conference center around the clock trying to draft this text by consensus, and it didn't work. It kind of melted down at the last minute. Heads of state flew in. Normally, by the way, heads of state don't negotiate things. They come in, they give a speech, they take a photo, they have a nice lunch, they give a press conference, and then they fly back out. Well, they arrived and there was nothing. So they had to actually sit in a room, which they hadn't done for almost 100 years at this scale, and negotiate something themselves, which they did. They kind of came up with a patch called the Copenhagen Accord, but it wasn't really the kind of long-term solution that we were all looking for. So we knew we'd have to try again. The world wasn't ready for it, but we'd figured out the kind of basic architecture of having countries set their own targets, having everyone involved, et cetera. Now, 6 years later in Paris, we succeeded with basically the same structure. So why is that? Well, what happened in the period leading up to Paris was a shift in the understanding of countries' self-interest, right? They went from feeling like they didn't really, like they felt they were being pressured to do this climate thing, but they didn't really want to, and it was expensive and it would cost them extra money and you go first after you, to a mentality of, okay, so clean energy is cheaper and it reduces air pollution and it has all these other benefits. And yeah, we can do this. We actually want to do this. And that shift of wanting to do it was very, very key. So that was a good background condition, right? But you still had this problem I've described of the UN and the need to do everything by consensus and the 30-ring circus that is one of these UN climate meetings. And how do you solve that? Well, the answer is you need leadership, and specifically US leadership. And that's why we're talking about this. So the first thing we needed was the US needed to lead by example, right? Now, the first Obama term, we didn't do a ton on climate. The president was focused on healthcare and other things and got criticized for not focusing enough on climate. But in his second inaugural, he gave Congress notice that Congress should do something about this, and if it didn't, he would. And 6 months later, he rolled out his climate action plan, which was the first comprehensive plan by an American president to deal with climate at home by reducing emissions and preparing for the impacts of climate change. That was really important internationally. It gave us credibility. It allowed us to come to the table with all the other 200 nations of the world and say, we're doing something. And when we say you should do something, we can back it up with our own action. The second thing we did was we looked at what had gone wrong in Copenhagen, which was that the US and China kind of behaved as captains of opposing teams. So the US was the captain of the developed countries, the rich countries that had been sort of stuck with this, all the responsibility in the previous paradigm, and China was standing up for the developing countries. And it was like, it was like this. So we knew that before we took another deal to this big multilateral unwieldy body, we needed to do a deal with China first. And we needed to sort it out with China, what kind of international agreement we would want, what kind of targets we would set for ourselves. So we started a secret process in early 2014 to develop a surprise climate deal between the world's two largest economies and two largest emitters that we could unveil way before the Paris conference and lead by example. That was a fun project. I'd be happy to tell you about it in the Q&A section. But we did succeed in the end, and President Obama and President Xi stood up in November of 2014 and surprised the world by announcing that the US and China they announced their targets early, and they made clear that this time of the US and China serving as captains of opposing teams was over. And sure enough, 12 months later, when we arrived in Paris, 180 other countries had announced their national targets. And that took a really big problem off the table, right? Because countries came to Paris already having announced what they were going to do and what they could do. And what was left to figure out was the actual machinery of an international agreement. Now, Paris was just as much of a logistical nightmare to some extent as Copenhagen. You have to sort of imagine thousands of people arguing for hundreds of hours over years and years without making any progress. And then at the last minute, in the last 48 hours or so, everyone stays up for like 2 or 3 days in a row and figures everything out. So, what is the Paris Agreement? Yep, there you see some of the fun photos from this time, or not so fun. So the Paris Agreement is basically a machine that enables these 200 nations of the world, these 200 little patches of Earth that constitute our planet, to ratchet down their carbon emissions over the course of the coming decades in a synchronized way. The Paris Agreement sets a long-term target. It says that our goal is to keep global warming to well below 2 degrees and preferably 1.5 degrees. And it sets the goal of reaching a net zero emissions global economy by the second half of the century. Now, since that agreement was concluded in 2015, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the world's scientists, have made clear that when we say second half of the century, we really mean 2050. And we need to get to a net zero global economy by 2050 if we are to avoid some of the worst impacts of climate change, whether you're concerned about snowpack, or you're concerned about coral reefs, or you're concerned about your own well-being and whether your house is above water. We got to do it faster. So what Paris does is it creates a system where every 5 years, every country sets a target, and those targets ratchet every 5 years. So it's kind of like 10 or 15 years out. And so every 5 years you come back and say, okay, I'm going to set my next target now, and my next target, and my next target. And there's a system for countries to get together and check each other's targets and whether the overall ambition of the whole is good enough or not. Now, all we've done so far in this system, which is built to last, is set the first round of these targets. So the United States set a target under Obama that we would reduce emissions by 2025 by 26 to 28% compared to 2005 levels. So we would drop emissions by a quarter in that time span. And of course, when President Trump announced that we were withdrawing from that from the agreement, that target is no longer really valid. But it's 2020 now, and we're due to submit our next target for 2030. And that's what other countries are working on right now. The agreement has some other provisions, which I won't necessarily get into, but the most important ones relate to transparency and the way that we check each other's targets and the stringency of each other's targets. Remember, this is not a top-down world government regime. That just doesn't exist. So we rely on the tools we have, which include naming and shaming, and they can include trade sanctions if countries want to impose those, but that's not part of the Paris Agreement itself. So we were not equipped with a great set of tools to begin with in the international system, and the Paris Agreement makes the best of what it has. It also provides for financial assistance to the poorest and most vulnerable countries that are suffering most from the impacts of climate change or have the least resources to make this energy transition, to protect their forests and so on. That's actually the part of the agreement that I negotiated in Paris. So lots of clapping, all gets done in 2015. What happens next? Well, what happened next is that every country in the world signed up to it formally, including us, right, at the time. But, when I say every country in the world, I mean North Korea, Syria, countries that have a lot going on and may not be paying attention to these things. And then we became the only country when President Trump made his announcement that said, actually, never mind, we don't like the structure. We can't really say why we don't like it. Yes, it allows countries to do what they want, subject to these checks and balances, but we just don't like it. So that was the unsatisfying explanation that accompanied the announcement to withdraw. The good news is, besides the fact that the agreement has held up, is that there are signs of really strong climate leadership in the United States, even in the absence of leadership coming from Washington. And obviously, POW is a great example of that. And you guys are in good company because you've got states, cities, and businesses, and religious organizations and universities. I mean, a huge army stood up and called itself We Are Still In, meaning we're still in the Paris Agreement, and showed up in force at the first big UN climate negotiation or talk that happened after Trump made his announcement, and just came out in force and really impressed the world. And the world realized that it's not like, the US president can turn an on-off switch on climate action here. That's not the way it works at all. So if you add up the states and the cities, for example, more than 70% of Americans of our economy, of our GDP, is in a state or city that has reaffirmed its commitment to the Paris Agreement. More than half of Americans live in a state or city that remains committed to the Paris Agreement. So that's the silver lining. But now you can see why US leadership is so important and why it's so damaging to withdraw from this agreement that we helped to broker. We are the world's largest economy. We're the world's largest historical emitter. No other country has more power to do good and rally the world around this cause. And equally, no country has the ability to do more harm by turning its back again on the rest of the world. Now, we can rejoin the agreement easily. We made sure of that in terms of the way the rules are written. What's going to be hard is regaining the trust of the world. And the other hard thing is going to be to actually do what's needed. We need to cut global emissions by 50% by 2030 to stay on target for 1.5 degrees. That's in 10 years, 2,500 working days, okay? Now think about 10 years ago, if you can. You remember 2010? Okay, maybe it seems like a long time ago, but maybe not, right? Global emissions were basically the same in 2010 as they are today. And in the future, equal amount of time in the future, they need to be cut by half. So as important as this election is, and as important it is to have the right administration in Washington, we're not going to solve this problem just by signing our name to an international agreement. The Paris Agreement isn't some sort of magical object that will solve our problems. It's just a machine that we've built to help its members, countries, ratchet their emissions to zero in the course of the coming decades. It creates a process for setting those targets, a transparency system to evaluate them and hold countries accountable for meeting them, and to provide some financial assistance to those who need it. That's what it does. The rest is up to us. We don't have time to wait another 4 years. The 2020s are the decisive decade, and the window will close. So I hope that's been a helpful introduction to what is a complicated and sometimes boring topic. And we're going to have a great discussion, I'm sure. But before we do that, I want to introduce or ask Maddie to introduce herself and tell us a little bit about why she chose to engage in this topic of the Paris Agreement. I understand, Maddie, that you declined an invitation to the White House in connection with the Olympics because of your view on this administration's position on the Paris Agreement. So why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about how you got engaged with POW and how you got engaged on this topic.
Thanks, Paul, for that great talk on the Paris Agreement. So I'm a U.S. Olympian in biathlon, which for anyone who doesn't know, it is the sport that combines cross-country skiing and rifle marksmanship. So we ski around on Nordic skis with a gun on our back, and we come into the shooting range and shoot with a high heart rate. So it's very challenging. And so the backstory on my decline to the White House. So basically, if you qualify for the Olympics and you're an Olympian, you automatically get invited to take a trip to the White House with Team USA and go meet the current president and have like a afternoon at the White House, basically. And going into the Olympic year, my teammates and I had already discussed, like, we knew that would be an option, and we kind of discussed that none of us were really interested in meeting the current president. And so once I qualified for the Olympics, I was kind of like, all right, I don't want to go to the White House and meet Donald Trump, but I would be interested in either doing some sort of protest at the White House, like if we could wear like POW shirts or something along those lines. But then that turned into, it wouldn't have worked because Team USA is very strict on like what you can wear. And so I reached out to POW because I had been working with them for the last couple of years, just doing talks and stuff like that. And so I remember emailing POW and just talking to them about brainstorming for an idea to have some other event going on, because I wanted to have the option to still do something that I felt was powerful and important. And I didn't think going to the White House and meeting President Trump, who had just like backed out of the Paris Agreement, would be that thing. So we brainstormed the idea of having this thing called Olympians on the Hill, and we got a handful of us, like I think there were maybe 5 athletes. We traveled to Capitol Hill. There's Kelly Clark and I. We traveled to Capitol Hill during the same weekend that Team USA would be at the White House, and we spoke with our representatives to discuss how they could sign on to different climate bills and just continue the work for climate action in our country. So, to be honest, I was like super nervous to even go down there and lobby because I even though I came up with the idea, I was still just like, oh, that's not for me. Like that's for someone who's more important than I am. And so I was definitely really nervous, and I realized on that first trip that the representatives and congressmen, they're all just normal people and they just want to have a conversation with you. And so once we went to our first meeting, it was way more relaxing after I realized that there aren't these scary, like, people. They're just normal people who want to have a discussion. So, and I'm not a climate scientist. I don't have all the knowledge that, like, even Paul has. So I just know that I love. And so if I just had, like, talked to them about my own story and my climate change story of like what I've seen. That's all they want to hear. And so that made me feel a lot better. And then I've done 2 different climate like lobbies with POW. The Olympians on the Hill was the same time as the Paris Agreement pullout, basically. And then I went again that following September, I believe, with a bigger group of POW Alliance members. And then most recently we did, since we couldn't travel to Capitol Hill this year, we did a digital lobby this past week. So that was definitely a little bit different. And I was less nervous and less sweaty and humid because I got to do it in the comfort of my own home and not down in DC. So yeah, that's kind of like my backstory of why I've gotten involved with POW, I guess. And why I just think that that I kind of switched that anger, like being mad at the president for not believing in climate change. I kind of switched that energy into trying to do something that I knew would be more impactful and important. And I think that is kind of why you guys are all here today also, is you want to feel like you're doing something and making a difference and not just sitting at your house getting angry at different politicians. So yeah, I guess now we'll kind of go to more Q&As if Paul wants to jump back in and we can like have a discussion, I guess, because we have a lot of questions.
Can I ask you a question first?
Yeah.
So when you talk to folks on the Hill, like what argument did you find hit home? What was the thing that, if any, that made their eyes light up and kind of where you felt like you really connected with them?
I feel like like connecting with them on a personal level of just being like, what do you like to do outside? Because most people spend time outside. And if we have a warming climate, that's going to change for everyone. So first, kind of like touching on that, just being like Paul, what do you like to do outside?
Oh,
like,
yeah.
you like skiing? And just like starting the conversation like that. And then for me, it was really just like, I like to rope it in because I've traveled all over the world for my competitions. So I kind of like to rope in just being like, oh, I've been to all these different places, and everywhere that I've gone, I'm seeing the same effects of climate change. Like it doesn't, like you were saying earlier, there's no boundary on climate change. It's affecting the entire world. And so I kind of talk about that and then rope it into like the local economies. Because for me, I'm in District 20, I believe, 20 or 21 in New York. And so Elise Stefanik is my representative. And for her, as a Republican, she's very like prone to focusing on the economy. And so I like to just talk with her about like how winter tourism is so big for these small ski towns in upstate New York. And that kind of like resonates with her a little bit more. So I guess it kind of depends on the person you're talking with. But that's kind of what I've noticed, that if I'm excited about, then they're usually excited. But in general, they're like usually really excited to talk to people who aren't just giving them tons of data and facts.
Cool.
Yeah. So let's see. We have a lot of questions from the people in the chat. So, Paul, did the US's withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement take effect, or is it in a legal battle currently? And what needs to happen for us to get back in if there is a change in the administration?
Yeah. So the way it works is that generally in international agreements, sometimes you have to ratify them, and sometimes you don't have to technically ratify them. It depends on the way the agreement is written. In this case, this agreement did not have to go to the Senate, the U.S. Senate, for ratification, and so it was able to take effect by executive order, right? So President Obama. And, we lodged our thing. And so we became a party to the agreement. And then the way it was written, which is typical, is that it takes effect when a certain number of countries representing a certain percentage of emissions sign up, right? And you can bet that in the last year of the administration, we pounded the pavement to make sure that that threshold was reached before the end of the Obama administration. And it was. The Paris Agreement entered into force in record time. And that meant that the next administration had like a 3-year cooling off period, actually, before it could actually lodge the notice to withdraw. And that notice was submitted to the UN last November, and it actually takes effect a further year after it's submitted. And ironically, so as of today, we are party to the agreement. And actually, the U.S. sent delegations to all these annual UN climate negotiations, even during this administration. The withdrawal notice takes effect the day after the presidential election. But Trump is president the day after the election, no matter what, right? So if he is not reelected, then in January 2021, the new president can very easily get the U.S. back into the agreement. That's the way it was designed. Yes.
So I guess what does it mean for the U.S. to have pulled out of the agreement? I guess you were saying it went to the Senate. Is that what you said? Or it doesn't go to the Senate?
No.
Okay.
It doesn't.
And then, so you were just saying that if we do get a new president, then it's really easy to just re-enter. Like, will we just automatically just be in, I guess?
We won't automatically be in, but it's the administrative part is very easy. And then we'll have to tell, but as I said, that's the easy part. The hard part is like showing up and being like, sorry, I sometimes say that, the US is like, Jekyll and Hyde, we're like Jekyll and Hyde. So when we're the good Dr. Jekyll, then we're working with everybody to design this agreement that will withstand us when we turn into Mr. Hyde. So now we've turned into Mr. Hyde, and we're like rattling the structure, and the structure's, it's good, it's holding. But at the same time, going in and saying, I started as a U.S. negotiator under the Obama administration at the State Department in 2009. And I remember that people loved Obama. They loved what he was saying. They loved what he stood for. But boy, there was a lot of leftover anger at what the U.S. had done in the Bush administration on climate. And it took, I would say, 2 or 3 years for us to work ourselves out of that hole, just on a basis of trust, and now we've done it again. So it's going to be tough. And those are years we can't afford to waste. And that's why it's been so important to show the rest of the world that even though the stuff happening in Washington isn't good, there's a lot of positive things happening. And POW is part of that story. And especially since, you and others, if you're competing internationally, if you are ambassadors for the United States, and people understand that now on climate.
Yeah, I definitely remember as soon as Trump became president and I went back over to Europe, everyone was like, how could you let that happen? I was like, trust me, I did not vote for him. So if we do stay in the Paris Agreement, how can we ensure that we not only meet our targets, but we end up going beyond them?
Yeah, so I won't sugarcoat it. It's going to be really hard. The longer, every year that we wait, every year that we don't take action makes every year after that harder, right? Because the envelope is closing for us to cut emissions to the levels they need to be cut. And if you just think of the annual rate that you have to hit every year that you don't do what you're supposed to do, it gets harder and harder. Now, we did, I work at an organization now called Rocky Mountain Institute, which is based here in Colorado, which works on clean energy and climate issues. And we did a big analysis that tried to answer this question that you're asking, which is, okay, what is it like? What can we accomplish if we really put our minds to it by 2030? And what will it take? And, so what we found was that if it's not like a pie in the sky scenario, if you kind of look at what's politically feasible, legally possible, if everyone puts their shoulder to the wheel, the US can cut emissions by almost 50% by 2030. But it's not a matter of just waiting for Washington to sort it out. And, I will tell you that even we, I think, had the wrong attitude in the Obama administration. When we set that target that I was telling you about for 2025, which is our national climate target, we modeled what that should be, right? We did a big analytic exercise. We had the EPA and the Department of Energy and all these folks involved. Well, the only thing we were looking at is what the federal government could do. We weren't really taking into account what states and cities and individual citizens could do on their own initiative. And we're now in the position where we have to take those things into account. So if you see a Biden administration set a national climate target and set out its agenda, that agenda is going to feature you more heavily because it has to. Because what we do in Colorado, or what we do in Denver or Boulder, or wherever you are in this area, is not optional. It's not nice to have. It's not like some complement to a federal policy. It's core.
Coming off of that, someone has a question that says, what can ordinary citizens do to recover the lost ground? And what would you like candidate Biden to be doing in this arena?
Yeah, so I think what you can do to recover lost ground is obviously make conscious choices in your own life that are aligned with your values on this and walk the talk. Especially if you're part of POW and you're out there advocating, it's really important to walk the talk, right? But what you did, Maddie, in Washington, and what the Citizens Climate Lobby, which someone mentioned in the chat, does. The Citizens Climate Lobby is another great organization, nonpartisan, goes to DC every year, that you can go to DC, I guess, and meets with practically every member of Congress and just, tries to show that constituents of every politician in every, district in this country want climate action. So it's partly about being kind of really aware in your own life, engaging locally, and also just as you said, not being afraid to put your own voice against this. If you went to Capitol Hill and you replicate, if anyone on this in this session did that, I think they'd find out what you found out, which is, hey, these are people. They have a job. By the way, they work for me. I'm a citizen. I elected these people, so they better listen to me, and they will listen to me. And so it's not easy. Obviously, there's a lot of interests that are stacked against it. But the good news that I mentioned earlier is that this is no longer a case of what's good for the economy is bad for the planet. These things are now completely aligned. And in this part of the country, we see that. We see coal plants being retired at a record rate, not necessarily only or even primarily because people are so passionate about climate, but because it's cheaper. In this part of the world, did you know it's actually cheaper to build new clean energy capacity on the grid than it is to turn a coal plant on and just operate it. That's like saying it's cheaper to buy an electric vehicle than a year's worth of gas. So that's how dramatically the economics have changed. And that's a total, wind at the backs of everybody here.
Yeah, definitely. Another person is wondering, what is a simple way to explain the current state of the agreement and why it's still important? Like, if someone was to ask me randomly, like, why I thought the Paris Agreement was so important and why, like, is there a simple answer to that, I guess, for someone?
Yeah. The countries of the world spent 30 years of trial and error putting it in place because they each needed the confidence that the other countries would act. And so without the agreement, we don't have that baseline, and people are always going to point fingers at each other. So now we finally have a unifying framework that goes all the way out to the ultimate solution of the problem, right? It's a long-term thing. It's a machine that ratchets all the way down to zero. And we're not going to be negotiating another one. So while the Paris Agreement it's not sufficient to address the problem, it is necessary. And the US is the most important country in the world in the diplomatic arena. And so we will not get where we need to go globally without an agreement like this and without the US in a leadership position, driving people and leading by example.
Since almost everyone, I'm assuming, in this chat is a skier, or many of them may work at ski areas, and if climate change continues at this skyrocket pace that we're seeing, it's going to affect our ski areas. So do you have any suggestions on how to talk to the GM or the CEO of ski areas in which these people work at, especially without drawing negative pushback, like creating tension between someone who controls their employment, basically?
Well, I would probably ask Pal this question. I mean, you guys have such a great track record of engaging these sports and these industries. But I would think that the GM of a ski area is going to be attuned to this problem more than most, because their livelihood depends on snowpack and climate and the weather. And what we're seeing, I mean, it's uneven, and climate change is complicated. It doesn't mean the same thing happens everywhere, but it's got to be a huge alarm bell and wake up call for that industry. And I think that industry has kind of organized itself at a kind of corporate level as well, to lobby on these issues. I think the harder thing is, you kind of look around and say, okay, I buy electricity, I drive a car maybe, or maybe I don't. What are the things that I do? What are the companies that I support with my business, right, that cause greenhouse gas emissions? And am I making it clear enough to them that I care very much where my power comes from, or I care, what's sort of embodied in the products that I buy? And even right now, what's kind of cool is that big companies that you might not associate with carbon or the emissions problem, like Google or Microsoft, they're actually out there buying 100% clean energy. So if they can do it, anyone can do it, and it's possible now in the market to do that. So we got to hold ourselves to account, whether it's a ski area, company, or someone who maybe has a little bit less of a direct interest in climate change.
Questions. The first one being, I'm super curious, what are the current countries that are still in, I guess almost every country is still in the Paris Agreement, I'm assuming. But do you know which countries are on track to meeting their target that they set, and like what that may consist of?
Yeah. So basically every country in the world is part of the Paris Agreement. So that's good. And that's what I said, we like when we were Jekyll, we were like able to design something that withstood our attempt to break it down later. And that's really big, right? Because if I think about all the all-nighters I pulled in the UN climate negotiations, arguing against countries like Saudi Arabia, right? Saudi Arabia didn't really want a global climate agreement. Saudi Arabia didn't want an agreement that would reduce demand for oil and gas. And there were a lot of other countries that weren't so convinced this was a good idea. Now look, these countries are standing firm when the US tries to get the G20, which is a group of the 20 largest economies in the world, to issue a statement or to peel off even Saudi Arabia or countries like it and say, well, don't you agree that the Paris Agreement was a bad idea after all? They'll say, no, we disagree. We think it was a good idea. We think it's necessary. So there's a complete locking of arms that's happened internationally with regard to the agreement itself. And, we look pretty stupid when we're the only country in the world that thinks that something like this is a bad idea, right? In terms of which countries are on track, a lot of countries are on track, right? So probably the best example is the European Union. The EU has a pretty deep target for 2030 already, which is 40% below 1990 levels, I think is the way they phrase it. So 40% cut, and they're on track to meet that. They've taken this pretty seriously, but they also have a different political culture. They don't fight as much in the EU about whether the government can do things or not. The government is more of a legitimate driver of social change than it is in the US. And so it's a more densely populated continent. They have public transportation, people ride to work on bicycles. It's just a little farther along, but they're showing the rest of the world that you can live happily and with wealth and, without being reliant on greenhouse gas emissions. So just to say, I think if you want to cut it a different way, where we're making the most progress is in our power generation systems. So electricity used to be the biggest source of US carbon emissions, and we've made big strides in shutting down the US coal fleet. More than half of it is now shut down. The rest of it, you could easily imagine it's shut down by 2030. So we're increasingly getting clean electricity. That's the furthest along. The second furthest along is probably transportation. More and more electric vehicles on the road, better and better charging infrastructure. We're not there yet, but pretty soon, within a few years, it will cost about the same to buy a new electric vehicle with similar features as it does to buy a new internal combustion vehicle. And if we solve the charging infrastructure issue fast enough, then you can see a way to solving the transportation issue. What's harder is things like how we make steel, how we make cement, how we build our buildings, how we make our existing buildings more energy efficient, how we deal with agriculture, preserve our forests. Those are a little bit harder than dealing with power systems or cars.
I have one last question for you. So if you could sum up in 2 sentences what POW volunteers could do to keep moving this initiative forward, what would you say?
You mean the Paris Agreement or POW?
A mix of both. Just the whole Paris Agreement and also just climate change action in general.
So I would say that, don't underestimate the power that you have as a citizen, as a consumer, as a socially, kind of publicly engaged individual in POW and as a leader in shaping the decisions that entire countries make and companies make and mayors and governors make that will affect the course of this problem. We live in an age where the silver lining of this whole story with Trump and the Paris Agreement is that everybody has realized that this is a job for everybody, and that even if the federal government doesn't get back in the game, we can make huge strides to reduce carbon emissions in this country and in the world. And frankly, if the election doesn't go if he gets reelected and we have 4 more years of this, that's going to be plan A, not plan B. So you are an important contributor to plan A on climate. That was more than 2 sentences, so I'm sorry about that.
I think Nathan might jump back in. I'm not sure what's after the Q&A.
Right. Thanks so much, guys. Thanks to Maddie and Paul for putting that on. Paul, you do a great job of making complex issues and ideas, easy to think about and easy to focus the attention on. So it takes for me, it took a really complex topic and focused our attention. So thank you. Something that everybody could do is we're asking everybody to text Keep Paris in one word to 65351. And what that does is it provides you with a link to contact your local congressman or congresswoman. So that's something that we can also do. And another thing is, if you're interested in getting involved more locally at a grassroots level, and interested in the Protect Our Winters local alliance, there's also there's an email below here or on the slide here that can email. And finally, thanks to Ryan Flahive for putting this all together. After this is all done, you can rewatch this or send this link to your friends or family that they want to watch it. It's going to be on his podcast, which is called Climate Changers. And it's also going to be on the Protect Our Winters YouTube channel. So I think it's going to be a great resource for the future. Thanks again.
Thing you guys have done for this cause, and thank you to Maddie for your advocacy. I can tell you, having been in Washington in the swamp myself, what a big difference it makes there, and the fact that you guys are visible in the rest of the world. People see you, and it matters what you do. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you,
Thanks again,
Paul, for being here, and thank you, Nathan, and everyone else with POW and POW volunteers. You guys are awesome, and keep up the good work. Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.